Okay, so this question said, discuss the usefulness of research in relation to explanations of mental illness. So you are assessing how useful the research is in being able to explain mental illness. So the research is Rosenham, it's Gottesman, and it's SARS. So that's the research you should be discussing. Is that research useful in terms of explaining mental illness? Can it explain mental illness or can it not? What are the reasons for it? Explain it. What are the reasons not? And then therefore, if it can explain it, it's useful, and if it can't explain it very well, it's not useful. So things that you could have talked about. If you remember, we did usefulness when we looked at debates, and this is what it said: if it progresses our understanding of mental illness, then it is useful. If it provokes further research, then it is useful. If it allows for, so this says here, therapies, interventions, preventive action or treatments, that there is practical applications. If you were to say, because of Rosenham, we've got practical applications in terms of treating mental illness. We know now not to just judge people on the situation, but to actually judge their behaviour in the context or something like that. Then you would be suggesting that it is useful, the research, because it's furthered our understanding of mental illness, that it can be a situational cause, not just a dispositional cause. If you're talking about it being valid. So, you might say things like Gottesman's very reductionist. It's just looking at biological explanations for genes being the cause of mental illness, when actually Rosenhan contradicts that, because Rosenhan's found that there could be situational explanations for behaviour that, maybe it isn't a mental illness as well. There's questions of that. So perhaps these pieces of research are not valid in what they're finding because there could be other explanations. So therefore it's not useful. You might say that in terms of being generalizable, Rosenhan's studies only looked at kind of hospitals in the US, so 12 hospitals. There's only 8 student patients that have gone in there, so his findings are not particularly useful because we can't generalize them to explain everybody's mental health. They're quite ethnocentric, so therefore they're not useful because it doesn't explain mental illness in any other country other than the US. In terms of lacking new knowledge or understanding, SARS has reviewed it, but he doesn't have any actual experimental research to support his findings or support his suggestions, shall I say, because he doesn't have any findings. So then that's not very useful. Lacking internal validity. You might say that because Rosenham was a participant observation, there's not a lot of control over extraneous variables. It's very different in different hospitals, so therefore perhaps it's not internally valid, which means that it's not a useful piece of research to explain mental illness. Things like generalizing it to the wider population. We mentioned that before about the sample. The samples that have been used, I think the Gottesman study is just in one country as well, so that can't be generalized to everyone's mental illness. You can't explain everyone's mental illness because you've only looked at them in one particular place. Research lacking ecological validity and application to the real world. Again, that's more about Rosenhan. Although it does have ecological validity, so it is useful. Gottesman's looking at genes, which is transferable across everybody because everyone's got genes, so that's ecologically valid, so that is useful. SARS is not useful because it's theory-based, it's no findings. So you can talk about all that kind of stuff. If we have a look at the mark scheme, and this is for a completely different question, but it's still a usefulness question. So if you see these in the mark schemes, you can use similar things. The beginning bit here is just talking about the phenomenon stuff. So this is talking about something completely irrelevant to what we've looked at. But it says here, what have we got? In assessing the usefulness of research, candidates can be expected to acknowledge limits to its usefulness, e.g. because of, oh no, that's just not relevant, but it does say things like connected to validity, reliability, sampling bias. Any kind of methodological issues are going to tell you whether or not that piece of research is useful or not in terms of can it explain behaviour, so can it explain that mental illness. It also says the extent to which research is useful needs to be assessed rather than simply identifying and illustrating. So you can't say, right, this research is useful, this research is not useful. That's not good enough. You are an A2 student, you should be assessing to what extent is it, how far is it useful. So you can say on the one hand it's useful for this reason, however it's not useful for this reason, so it's got limited usefulness in this area but it's quite useful in this area. So you should be constantly kind of evaluating that, and you'll notice here that on this this question, it's a 15 marker, so you need a lot more things. For those types of questions, usefulness questions, you should be using that evaluation sheet that you were given that's got all the evaluation issues on there, all the debates, all the kind of like ethics and that kind of thing. Everything should be on there. That you can use in this type of question, but you've got to link it back to whether that means that it's useful or not. Some questions that I read didn't even mention the word useful in them, so you did not address the question. You also didn't mention the research. You were talking a lot about the theory and the explanations for mental illness. That's not what the question asks for. The question says discuss the usefulness of research in relation to the explanations. So you can bring in the explanation a little bit, but your focus is on the usefulness of that research in explaining, the mental illness. So that was how you should have answered that question.